Well, this is what happens with these wars. I mean, they just continue to escalate. There's a big strike coming one way, the bigger strike coming back, and that's how these things unravel and keep going. And it's why the war needs to come to an end. Look, every time you see these big strikes from one side or the other, it's a reminder of why this is a terrible war that's now gone on longer than the Second World War, and it needs to come to an end. And the U.S. stands ready and prepared to help do whatever we can to help facilitate the end of this war. Hopefully the opportunity will present itself at some point that we can play that role again.
After Sergey Lavrov's stark warning about fresh strikes on Kyiv, is Trump's team now scrambling to revive a stalled peace push, trying to sound proactive even as missiles keep slamming into the Ukrainian capital? With Washington deeply entangled in a brutal conflict with Iran, how convincing is Rubio's claim that the US is still ready and prepared to help end the Ukraine war, a conflict he admits has now dragged on longer than World War II? As Putin unleashes yet another missile and drone barrage on Kyiv, does Rubio's somber tone expose a US that is struggling to handle a spiraling Ukraine war it cannot control, but also cannot walk away from? With Moscow warning of systematic strikes and urging foreign nationals to leave Kyiv, is Trump's top diplomat now cornered on the world stage, forced to talk diplomacy while Russia puts every embassy on edge? As President Zelensky begs for more air defenses and aid, does Rubio's promise of US mediation sound hollow, coming on yet another day when Russian missiles and drones are still falling on Ukrainian cities? On May 26, Marco Rubio said the United States is ready and prepared to help bring the war in Ukraine to an end, casting Washington as a willing mediator despite repeated failed attempts at peace. Rubio made the remarks during his visit to India, even as Russian strikes once again targeted Kyiv on May 25, underscoring the gap between diplomatic talk and the reality on the ground. The US Secretary of State noted that the conflict has now lasted longer than World War II, calling it a terrible war and using that comparison to stress how urgently it needs to end. Rubio insisted that Washington still remains ready to mediate between Moscow and Kyiv despite fresh Russian strikes, saying the US stands prepared to step in whenever an opening for talks appears. The US stands ready and prepared to help facilitate the end of this war, Rubio said, framing America as eager to play a constructive role even if neither side is currently willing to compromise.
Well, this is what happens with these wars. I mean, they just continue to escalate. There's a big strike coming one way, the bigger strike coming back, and that's how these things unravel and keep going. And it's why the war needs to come to an end. Look, every time you see these big strikes from one side or the other, it's a reminder of why this is a terrible war that's now gone on longer than the Second World War, and it needs to come to an end. And the U.S. stands ready and prepared to help do whatever we can to help facilitate the end of this war. Hopefully the opportunity will present itself at some point that we can play that role again.
Rubio's comments came after Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov warned that new strikes on Kyiv were coming, heightening fears that the capital could face a sustained wave of attacks. Moscow also urged foreign diplomats and nationals to leave the Ukrainian capital, a step that instantly raised the temperature and hinted at a possible escalation in both scale and targets. Russian officials have threatened systematic attacks on Kyiv, explicitly mentioning decision-making centers, language widely read as a warning that political and military command hubs could be hit. Russia's foreign ministry said Lavrov went so far as to advise the United States to evacuate its diplomats from the embassy in Kyiv, suggesting Washington's own personnel might no longer be safe. Rubio later clarified that Russia had sent similar warnings to all the embassies in the city, indicating that the message was broad rather than uniquely aimed at the US mission. On May 26, the Kremlin said it had no information about how the US had responded to Russia's strike warnings, stressing instead that its priority was simply to ensure the warnings were understood. We have no such information at the moment. We have heard some official statements from the European capitals and EU representatives in Kyiv. Our priority is the warning that we have issued. The Russian Foreign Ministry's warning of strikes on Kyiv says that these strikes will be systematic. Does this mean they will happen daily or repeat with a certain frequency? Can you share the details with us? Well, systematic doesn't mean periodic. These are not the same thing. In fact, the Foreign Ministry's statement contains comprehensive information. These latest warnings followed a wave of drone and missile strikes over the weekend on Kyiv, another brutal round in a pattern of nighttime barrages aimed at the capital. Authorities reported that at least 4 people were killed and 91 injured in the May 24 barrage, illustrating the human cost of Russia's intensified attacks. The Lukyanivka neighborhood suffered heavy damage, with rescuers picking through twisted rubble and burned-out buildings as they searched for survivors and victims. More than 70 foreign diplomats visited the struck area to pay their respects to the victims, a show of solidarity meant to signal continued international backing for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine claimed Russia had fired nuclear-capable missiles alongside other aerial weapons at Kyiv, warning that the use of such systems marked a serious escalation. Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations condemned the escalating attacks of May 23 to May 24, urging the international community to respond more forcefully to Russia's latest bombardment.
We wish to draw your urgent attention to the fact that the Russian Federation has reached a new appalling level of aggression against Ukraine by further intensifying its attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. On the night of May 23 to May 24, Russian armed forces launched one of the largest combined attacks against Ukraine, employing hundreds of aerial weapons, including ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as unmanned aerial vehicles. For the city of Kyiv, this was one of the most devastating attacks recorded to date. Other regions of Ukraine were also severely affected. Many civilians have been killed and injured across Ukraine. The Russian Federation appears to have struck the city of Bila Tserkva with an Oreshnik medium-range ballistic missile specifically designed to carry nuclear warheads. Russia's repeated use of nuclear-capable missiles constitutes an unacceptable escalation. We strongly condemn Russia's escalating attacks against civilians, civilian objects, and Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure constitute grave violations of international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. Russia's ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine constitutes a grave and continuing violation of the Charter of the United Nations and of fundamental principles of international law, and undermines the rules-based international order as well as international peace and security. We reiterate our demand that the Russian Federation immediately cease its war of aggression and ensure the full, immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We welcome the sustained efforts of the United States, European countries and other member states aimed at bringing this war to an end. We stand united in our determination to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine, consistent with the UN Charter, including the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. And the last point, we also condemn recent threats by Russia to diplomatic institutions and embassies in Kyiv. This is something which we cannot accept.